I'm offering you today the fourth in a little series of what we've been doing in an afternoon discussion over Zoom. This is very much just a little summary of where the discussion went live, and I'm sorry that it is just a wee summary, but it'll at least give you a little bit of a flavour of things. Today we were reading a text in the Old Testament from Ezekiel and looking at how three different art representations of that story what they showed, what they asked us to reflect about. We had a good afternoon. I think in some ways we were really just needing to look not so much even to comment, except that we certainly did have some discussion, and it is quite an interesting passage. It's an interesting passage because it's been so significant for the people who are Jewish, that nation of Israel. It's become quite a political passage over history. But for us as Christians, it's a very famous passage because it has something of a sense of what the resurrection life is about, what the risen life is about. Paul quotes a little bit from Ezekiel in his letter to the Romans. So I'm going to just hand over to the recording I made earlier of this Zoom, and I hope that you'll enjoy looking at the art. So here we are in week 4, and today we've been looking at, well, two things from the 20th century, a bit of sculpture and a painting, and before that some extraordinary wall painting from the 3rd century. Very different kinds of works of art, and all three of them associated with a very famous passage in the book of the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 37. It's to do with a prophecy over a valley of dry bones. And the text tells that the hand of the Lord was upon the prophet Ezekiel, and who brought Ezekiel out by the Spirit of the Lord and put him in the middle of the valley full of bones. And the prophet was asked to prophesy to these bones, and little by little these bones took on sinews and skin and came to life. And the message was that these bones, it said, are the whole house of Israel. Israel says, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off. And therefore Ezekiel had to prophesy and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says, O my people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Well, we looked at three works of art that were inspired by this very famous passage in Ezekiel chapter 37. And the first was from a place called Dura Europos. It's in eastern Syria, very near the Euphrates River, and it was a synagogue that has been rather miraculously preserved from the 3rd century. And one of the most interesting things about it is that it has paintings on the walls, paintings of biblical stories. And what we shall see is that for that particular community in Dura Europos, the text in Ezekiel was a very rich and powerful text for them. Let's have a look at the picture. So here we are. This is the first part of the cycle of 3 panels in the synagogue telling the story of Ezekiel. Now, it needs a little bit of interpretation because this art is not just immediately obvious to perhaps us nowadays. What you have is the figure of Ezekiel, this man, in 3 different representations. It's the same person. So it's as it were taking us through the story. And if you remember, the story begins with Ezekiel telling us that the hand of the Lord was upon me. So there, I think, is the hand of the Lord being upon Ezekiel. And he was told to go to prophesy to these dry bones. Now, of course, it drew our attention that they weren't really bones that were lying around in these bits of feet and hands and heads, but, well, they weren't just dry bones. We are not terribly sure why that was, unless that was what they preferred or could only picture at that time. But in any case, Ezekiel, having prophesied to the bones, then in the third picture is becoming what we're told is a witness, seeing the bones come together. And the hand of God, of course, keeps on being absolutely over the whole picture. And according to the commentary, there's an earthquake. Now, there's no mention of an earthquake in Ezekiel chapter 37, but one of the early commentaries, and I was mentioning last Sunday in church that for Jews it was terribly important to treasure the scriptures, but it was also very important to treasure all the teachings that accumulated around the scriptures. And one of the teachings about this passage in Ezekiel chapter 37 was that it was as if when an earthquake happened, the bones came together, and perhaps this is exactly what's being pictured here. This is a sort of a mountain being split, and these bones, which are all in their different parts initially in the picture, then begin to become whole bodies. Now, as the sequence of paintings goes on, there are other paintings still in the sequence which show these bodies which are prone. In this particular illustration, the bodies rise up and stand, and the word seems to be coming true, that the sovereign Lord is bringing people back from the graves and bringing them back to the land of Israel. And one of the fascinating things about this particular synagogue in Dura Europos was that there was also a very early rabbinic commentary that survived from that period that tells us that there was a tradition that they believed Ezekiel had been around this place called Dura in the Syrian desert. He certainly was away from Jerusalem. He was in exile in the 6th century BC, Ezekiel, and it almost suggests that the prominence of these Ezekiel stories in the synagogue at Dura Europos was inspired, that the prominence was inspired by the fact that there they were as Jews in exile. They'd been driven out of Jerusalem. The temple had been destroyed in AD 70, and the Jews were scattered around all over the place, really. But perhaps these particular Jews who worshipped in that synagogue were being reminded as they looked at the Ezekiel story that they might yet hope that the Lord would bring them back to Israel. Well, that was the first picture. And then we went on to another picture. If I just close this one. And the next picture is a quite different sort of picture. As you see, it's called the Politics of Prophecy, or at least the commentary on this is called the Politics of Prophecy. And this is a large menorah, a seven-standard candlestick, such as would once upon a time have been the form of the light that was set around the tabernacle. If we go right back to the book of Exodus, but this menorah it's 4.5 meters high. It's made of bronze, and it's situated outside the Israeli Knesset, the parliament in Jerusalem. And it was made in the 1950s by a British artist, actually, and as a gift from Britain to the State of Israel. And on this menorah are carvings. You can see a little bit if I just zoom in here, that this apparently at the bottom of this carving is of the retaking of or the rebuilding of the land of Israel. You can see a mine there. You can see somebody working with a pick, trying to make the ground fertile. A people rebuilding, in other words. But then as we go up, this, by the way, is Shema Israel. If you were with me on Sunday, those words of Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And then this picture here, sadly, of apparently of the Warsaw Ghetto. There's a Jew wearing the cross of David. Jews were marked out in the Warsaw, as in other cities in Europe, by the the Nazis initially herded together and allowed to go nowhere else and ultimately taken off to the death camps. And then above that is, and just above eye level this is the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel looking really as a fit young man. You can see his musculature, he's clean shaven, he's got a hand outstretched and as it were, maybe in blessing or maybe in support, I don't know. And beneath him you can see bones, dead figures, contorted in discomfort, but perhaps just beginning to come to life. So Ezekiel, at the very middle, if you remember, of this menorah, absolutely where if you stood right next to it, you would be looking straight at Ezekiel. This giving a little bit of a clue as to the hope that the sculpture is trying to represent. I mean, if we go further up the middle, by the way, we get to next a picture of Ruth holding her sheaves, and apparently the kneeling figure is Rachel weeping for her children. And you can see again a light stand and anticipation of the Davidic throne, the throne of David, and then up to the Ten Commandments, and then above the Ten Commandments the figure of Moses with his hands out and blessing and teaching. But you know, altogether this menorah with Ezekiel at the heart is, as the commentator says, something of a political statement, because it was made in the, as I said, in the 1950s. The State of Israel had been set up again after the Second World War, and it was a reflection on, this is the Lord bringing his people back to the land. Well, that was what Ezekiel absolutely had been asked to prophesy. Now, even though we as Christians may have just slightly, well, we will certainly have a bit of a different emphasis on some of the interpretation questions. The point of today is to allow us to see how other people have reflected on Scripture and to see perhaps things that we hadn't noticed before in the text, as well as to appreciate what artistic creation has gone around the celebration, the love of Holy Scripture. So there's that menorah. That was the second picture. And then the last picture is a rather darker picture. As you see, the commentary is called a Holocaust Vision. And although this painting was painted in 1980, the artist has left his own commentary on it, and he certainly was very much reflecting on the events of the Holocaust, or the Shoah as Jews would call it, the attempted extermination of the Jewish race by the Nazis in Hitler's Germany. And so we're looking at what is really a really rather ghastly cavern, very largely in black and white. On the hillside are really, yes, well, what are they? Are they gravestones? Are they trees? Possibly, yes, barbed wire, maybe a sentry post. Dark clouds, black and white, as if to remind us of this was done in 1980, but as if to remind us of the newsreels, of the newspaper reports of how they'd found emaciated bodies and so many dead when they opened up the death camps. But amongst this picture, and it is very much around the story of Ezekiel, around the picture of dry bones, of death, of grim destruction, of people who have been slain, as the text in Ezekiel chapter 37 says, there is the beginnings of life. And this figure is, although it's got a head of hair and a bony, very bony skeletal top, it then is pure skeleton further down. And yet the lovely thing is that with this figure, he or she is holding up a left hand to this hand here, of this male figure, we think, and The right hand is joining with that male figure's left hand, yes? And for all that this male figure is cradling perhaps his female figure, we think he is, surely, and she's looking at him, and there's almost a reminder of, yes, who we're meant to be, male and female. God has created us. God has given us a garden to inhabit in this world. You can still see by the rib cage, by perhaps the distended body, not, I don't think this is a pregnant body, this is a sign of terrible suffering. There is in the warm colouring the hints of life coming back. I mean, the artist is certainly asking us to think, well, is death the last word? Ezekiel's prophecy in Ezekiel chapter 37 is that even where there has been death, the Lord can bring us back. Now, of course, on the back of that has arisen a wonderful and very rich Christian reading of that text, and Paul picks it up in the letter to the Romans. It comes in the book of Revelation. Certainly you probably have heard sermons in church on Ezekiel chapter 37. But today we're looking at how Jewish commentary, Jewish painting works with that story. Still an insistence that death cannot have the last word if God is in the picture. Now, God is not being drawn in this picture. There's no hand of God as there was literally in that first depiction in the synagogue at Dura Europos. But there is, it would seem, life, even where there was this cataclysmic horror of millions upon millions being killed. So that was our session together today. I suppose we did inevitably talk quite a lot about this picture in the end, rather than about the earlier ones, which really needed a lot of explanation even to know what we were looking at. But all three together, ways of seeing, ways of thinking about this rather wonderful text in the book of the prophet Ezekiel. So thank you for listening.